Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Meet the Author webinar. Our curriculum today is hands-on, real-world lessons for middle school classrooms, food safety, developed by the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I'm Elena Massler with the National 4-H Council, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, the webcast console you were looking at can be completely customized, which means you can open, close, resize, and move any of the windows you have open. The icons at the bottom of your screen represent various widgets that you can open or close, and I'd like to highlight just a few of them now. First, the question mark represents the help guide, which covers common technical issues. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, try clicking here first. The message icon in the middle of the list opens the group chat box. We recommend that you open group chat as it's a great way to communicate with fellow attendees, and it's also where you can ask questions of the presenter. The piece of paper represents the resource list. There you'll be able to view and download a copy of today's presentation as well as a list of materials needed for the activities. There are also links to the 4-H Mall and to upcoming webinar registration. And then lastly, the person icon has presenter information, which contains Jennifer's bio and her contact information. A recorded version of the webcast will be available in approximately 24 hours, and it can be accessed using the same link that you used to sign on today. So please feel free to listen again and also share with your colleagues. Our presenter today is Jennifer Richards, Assistant Professor at the University of Tennessee. She currently serves as the Curriculum Specialist in 4-H with an emphasis on curriculum design, and she developed and directs the hands-on real-world lessons for middle school classrooms program. Jennifer, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you for having me. The hands-on program started in approximately 2005, initially as a program to serve classroom teachers at the middle school level in language arts, social studies, math, and science, with lessons that were designed and correlated directly to state content standards, but focused around the topic of food safety. So about 4 years ago, we developed this partnership with 4-H and began working to adapt the classroom component to, for use in 4-H clubs and project groups. When we look at the curriculum design for the hands-on program for the 4-H unit, we did this using the 5E inquiry-based model of instruction, which begins with the concept that you start with engaging students in the topic, finding ways to take what is outside their lives, sort of outside that project group, and move them into explore, where they get their hands dirty, in our case, quite literally, and they get to touch and play with materials that allow them to build those sort of intrinsic curiosity type questions about the materials and the concepts that you're going to be discussing in the overall unit. Then it moves into explain, the third step, which is where we give the bulk of the actual content. The theory there being that if we allow them to explore the concepts first, they build sort of a schema to hang the meat of the new content on. They've got some personal experience with the materials and with the concepts, so when I come back and I explain it to them, they've got some things to hang that on, and it allows their brain to make sense of that in a more organized fashion. Moving through to elaborate. The elaborate stage is where we ask students to then apply what they've learned, and this allows that sort of formative assessment check to make sure that the new concepts are things that they are mastering. And then evaluate, which on our slide here on our model is kind of at the 10 o'clock position, actually happens throughout the process. It's not an in-step evaluation. It sort of happens throughout because we're doing those constant formative assessments throughout the curriculum. So our general concept with this curriculum was to create really high energy, hands-on activities that allowed us to model best practices in instructional delivery for adolescent students. Looking a little more generally at the overall curriculum design, the 4-H curriculum contains 10 independent activities. We are still building on those basic skills and concepts from their core content classes in the classroom, but we have not, we were able, not being aligned to the state content standards for 4-H, we were able to kind of focus in on the really high energy interest stuff We've included several different types of assessments for each of those activities. There are some more traditional kind of assessments of kind of question answer to check for understanding, but then there are also very authentic type tasks where we're presenting them with a problem or a scenario, and we're asking them to create products to address that. And so those 10 activities are designed to move sequentially 1 through 10. However, each individual activity is designed so that it can stand completely on its own. One of the things that was really important to us as we developed this curriculum was to provide opportunities for critical thinking, but also to make sure that the food safety concepts we were teaching our 4-H members tied directly to life skills as well, and to make sure that we're laying that foundation for safe food handling. One of the things that we know is that adolescence is a time in which their brains are firing like crazy and they're developing those lifelong habits. And so if we can get in at the ground level and teach them these habits from the beginning, then we're not dealing with having to change behavior down the road. There are a couple of things throughout the curriculum, little symbols that I'll address real quickly, and then we'll just run through all 10 activities and give you the highlights and what we're accomplishing with each. You'll see the success marker throughout the activity sheets, and these are located in the lesson plan at places where there are sort of benchmarks for student success. So activity 1 is a hand washing lab, and you'll find the success marker off to the side when we ask students to set up their Petri plates. And so that's just sort of a visual check for you as the instructor of once they've set their plates up correctly, then they are on task for benchmarks for that particular lesson. The did you know circles include just additional background and facts, little trivia pieces of information about foodborne illnesses or food safety concepts. The tips component includes just little things we've noticed about classroom management or management of students, or the types of questions that students would typically ask in a given activity, just to give you a heads up on common problems that you might run into and how to address those on the front end. And then those boxes that are green that are labeled instructor talk, those are places where we've really tried to frame how you might start that dialogue. So it might say something like, today we are going to learn a little bit about how bacteria grow and how we can control that growth when we're dealing with food. So just giving you some dialogue ideas. So let's look at activity 1 and the major concepts there. Activity 1 is entitled, How Clean Are Your Hands? This activity is built around a hand washing experiment, and here's what I will say that is critically important about this. It is highly unlikely outside of a controlled lab setting that you're going to get the, quote, right answer with this hand washing experiment. Students set up Petri plates with the control being their unwashed hands, and then you divide your students into 3 groups. One group does a hand washing treatment of cold water with no soap for 5 seconds. One group does the CDC recommended warm water with soap for either 10 or 20 seconds. When the curriculum was originally written, it was 20 seconds. In the last year or so, CDC has revised that for a 10-second time limit. And then the third is just hand sanitizer, because we find that a lot of our kids think if they use hand sanitizer, they don't ever actually have to wash their hands with soap and water. And so this activity is set up to compare the outcomes of those 3 treatments on hand washing. Now, what we typically find in this process is that the cold water tends to show more growth after washing. The warm water is kind of a draw. It's all over the map. And those students who use hand sanitizer tend to have almost no growth on their plate at all on either the control or the treatment side, because most of our kiddos tend to touch the top of that plate without letting the sanitizer dry, and the alcohol and the sanitizer diffuses through the Petri plate and zaps pretty much all growth across it. However, what comes out of this is even more important, because we have multiple opportunities to reinforce to our kiddos what the proper hand washing treatment is and opportunities to model that for them. But what we teach them in that experiment about thinking like a scientist is far more valuable. Science is not about getting the right answer. It's not about following a cookbook procedure and getting the outcome that you seek. Science is about experimenting, looking at the results you've got, drawing conclusions, figuring out what went right and what went wrong. And in this activity, we get the opportunity to lead students through a deconstruction of their experiment to say, okay, look at our results. Are they valid? What constitutes valid results in a scientific experiment? Did we have enough replication? Did we have a high enough sample? Do we trust the data in front of us? And what we find out in this activity is that no, we don't, because we weren't able to control all kinds of things. We don't know what the temperature of the water was when we washed our hands in cold. We don't know the temperature when it was warm. They cannot tell you how many mils of soap they used when they washed their hands or how many milliliters of hand sanitizer they used on their hands. They all washed their hands in different ways. They didn't use a timer. Some dried it off on the paper towels. Some dried it off on their jeans, right? And so we can really pick apart the procedures that they used and where they did not control variables, and then lead them through that higher order thinking process of saying, okay, if we were going to do this again, what would it need to look like to give us results that we could trust, that were valid? What do you think the CDC does when they do this to make recommendations to the public as a whole? And that becomes a very powerful thinking exercise and problem-solving exercise for our students that gives them an idea of what the true nature of science is. And so in Activity 1 and then Activity 2 is the follow-up. We'll preview it in just a second. We set up that hand-washing experiment. We are working with students to help them develop an understanding of the scientific method, how you set up an experiment, how you identify controls and variables, and then following appropriate lab safety rules and procedures. We kick off Activity 1 with this question, and I'll ask you to think about it as we go. On a scale of 1 to 10, how clean do you think your hands are right now? Now on my screen, the beginning of this question is cut off a little bit. I'm not sure if that's what you guys are seeing or not. But the question asks, on a scale of 1 to 10, how clean do you think your hands are right now? With 1 being dirty, maybe I picked up some dog poop on my way in today, and 10 being super clean, I'm scrubbed and ready for surgery. When I ask this question to audiences, typically they give me answers somewhere in the 5 to 7 range. And then I would ask, again, I'm not sure what you're seeing on your screen. Mine's coming in a little odd. I would ask you to list 10 things that you've touched since the last time you washed your hands. And then as our members start, as our students start making these lists, they're handling things like their cell phones. Okay, when was the last time you cleaned and sanitized your cell phone? They'll mention they touched doorknobs or lockers or their desks or their chairs. And it's an opportunity to really get them to think about all the things that they touch with their hands in a given day and the last time that they really washed their hands well. And so this allows us to set the stage for them on Activity 1 of saying, okay, so what we're going to be talking about is bacteria and where you get it and why it matters and how you can transfer it from your hands and things that you touch into food products that could potentially make you sick down the road. So then in Activity 2, students come back and look at their Petri plates after they've had a couple of days to grow. So if you have an incubator, you can incubate those plates at 24 hours at about 36 C. If you do not have an incubator, they will grow really nicely at room temperature in about 48 hours. And so leading them through the process of looking at their plates and then as a group aggregating that data so that we see what the number of colonies were on our control, our unwashed hands, and then the colony growth by treatment 1, 2, and 3. The students then kind of aggregate this data by summing and meaning each of those treatments and looking at trends. And as I said a few minutes ago, this is where we really dig into Where's our data accurate? Where is our data perhaps flawed? Do we trust these results? We draw conclusions from the data we see, but is that accurate, right? Is that the kind of data we would report out to the public? Again, here, really digging into those higher order thinking skills and then leading them through that process of, okay, if we were going to do this correctly in a way that we came out with data that we could trust, how would we need to set this experiment up? And in generating a researchable question, we walk them through that process of outlining an experiment, identifying a hypothesis, and then predicting what they think the outcome of that experiment would be if they were to actually implement it. Activity 3, we have now moved through the engage and the explore. Now we really sink into the meat of explaining with activity 3. And so here we are asking students to do a little bit of research. There's a presentation for the facilitator or the instructor to give to the students on foodborne illnesses, and it will walk them through bacteria and then briefly viruses and parasites, although the primary focus here is on common foodborne pathogens that are bacterial. And then we ask students to create a raft. So we're moving a little bit into that elaborate stage where we're asking them to take the new content we've given and then generate a product that shows the application of their knowledge. Rafts were initially designed as creative writing tools for language arts, but they work really well in this setting. We ask students to assume a role, to write to a specific audience in a particular format or a particular topic. And so an example here might be we would ask them to assume the role of a helpful bacteria writing to the audience of teenagers in the format of a rap song on the topic of, can I help you? And so in this situation, they're pulling information from that presentation on helpful bacteria, because we want to also present helpful, not just pathogens. We don't want to just scare the daylights out of them. And so we look at things like pediococcus and lactobacillus, those bacteria that are used to ferment food products that they would be familiar with, meats, cheese, right? And then they create a rap song showing how that bacteria can be helpful. And this activity allows them to really synthesize the information before we move into the application phase. In activity 4, we focus on bacterial growth. And so bacterial growth is a really good example of exponential growth, right? And so we know that bacteria double in number, not in size. And so we compare and contrast growth between humans and growth between bacteria. And we walk them through those sort of multiplication activities. If I start with 4 cells and they have an hour and a half to grow and they have a generation time of 60 minutes, how many cells will I have after an hour and a half? Those type of activities. This allows them to do some calculation, to really dig into deconstructing and solving word problems, which is a huge part of Common Core math, while also understanding why some of those basic food safety concepts are important, why we have those refrigerate within 2-hour sorts of time limits. In activity 5, students start in sort of a carousel activity where they are rotating around the room, answering a number of different questions about their own personal practice. The one that always gets me in trouble is the last time there was cookie dough in my home, and then the answers range everywhere from prepared it and ate only the cooked dough to I sampled some of it raw. And that always gets me in trouble because I'm a huge fan of cookie dough, even though I know I'm not supposed to. And then again, we're really working on applying what they've learned. So we walk students through creating sort of an advertisement in the format of a press release that could go out into the community, really educating consumers on those 4 basic concepts of food safety: cook, clean, chill, and separate. So here we're working on some writing skills. We're working on a little bit of informational research and understanding credible sources and citing sources appropriately. and then creating a product that can be shared outside of the group. Activity 6 begins to help students understand common pathogens with what those pathogens' typical sources are, what the symptoms look like, and what that onset time is. And so they'll do some research on a number of pathogens using the Bad Bug book that the FDA maintains online. And then they will work through a series of problem scenarios. Tommy ate tuna salad at a family picnic, and 3 days later he had watery diarrhea with no fever but intense stomach cramps. And so then they have to go back through the content that they researched to try to determine what was the most likely pathogen responsible. In Activity 7, we want to look at foodborne illness from the perspective of sort of a geospatial or global perspective. And so here students are researching outbreaks using CDC websites to look at outbreaks around the world, and then to try to determine from those reports what the cause was, the number of people who were affected, and then really start to tease that apart and look at where there are similarities and differences across the globe. And so one of the things that we want to kind of focus students on here are what are those connections between standards of living and incidences of foodborne outbreaks. And the kids always want to say, well, I think where the standard of living is lower, you would have more foodborne outbreaks. But when we dig into the data, again, we have an opportunity to address that misconception, because we find out that's not actually true. It's that the types of outbreaks are very different depending on standard of living. We tend to have more in industrialized nations than we do in developing nations, right? Some of that has to do with access to health care and structure and function of the government to report those things out. And so we get to dig into some of those good geopolitical issues with nations across the world. We also get to look at the types of pathogens that we see in different regions of the world. In developed nations where there are more high protein meat sources in the diet, we tend to see more E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter. Where there is less high protein meat sources in those diets in developing countries, we tend to see more water-based pathogens, Bacillus cereus, things that are associated with grains. And so Activity 7 leads them through deconstructing that process. In Activity 8, we want them to study a case study of a press release from the USDA, really focused on educating consumers on cook, clean, chill, and separate. And then we are allowing them to sort of apply that here by giving them a scenario of a poor young woman named Melanie who clearly has not had good food safety education training in her life. And students work through that case study to identify the mistakes that Melanie makes as she prepares this meal for her family. And then at the end, we ask the students to predict the possible outcomes of Melanie's mistakes, and getting them to understand that those possible outcomes do include getting sick, that do include dying, but they also include maybe nothing happens. And getting our kiddos to understand that just because we make mistakes, sometimes there are no consequences, A, because our food supply in the U.S. is incredibly safe, but B, sometimes we also just kind of get lucky. And so just because we've always defrosted our chicken on the counter and we've not died from it yet is not a good reason to continue behavior that we know is risky related to the growth of pathogens. So that's what Activity 8 focuses on. Activity 9, we ask students to really kind of think big picture and to look back over the previous 8 lessons and engage in a digital storytelling exercise where they craft a video presentation to share out with others outside of the group that is sort of the culmination of all of their knowledge to this point. And we walk them through storyboarding and creating the script and then creating that digital story that they can share out. And then what good is a food safety curriculum if you don't get an opportunity to practice all the new food safety handling skills that you've learned. And so activity 10 is constructing an edible bacterial cell. And here students are hopefully using all of their new cook, chill, clean, and separate skills to construct a cell model that models all of the major components of bacterial cells using food components that they can then cook and eat as a group. I've included here the link for you to the curriculum on the 4-H Mall site. And the other thing that will go up very shortly is a list of resources and materials to accompany that. And I am happy to answer any questions that you have.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jennifer. If anyone has questions, go ahead and type them in the group chat box. And I will note that in the resource list, there is a list of the materials and all of the things you need to do to prepare to facilitate this lesson. And we do hope to offer a kit through the 4-H Mall, but unfortunately it's not ready yet. So at this time you'll have to source it yourself. And Jennifer, we have a few questions in the group chat box. They're about how long is each lesson geared for?
Okay, so within each lesson it'll give you timestamps for those. They range from 45 minutes to a couple of days. I mean, obviously that digital storytelling in activity 9, that's going to take some time. You're not going to do that in 45 minutes. It might be something that you start with them in a club meeting and then they bring their final product to the next club meeting. However, the in-person, face-to-face instructional component of those are set up to be about 45 to 60 minutes. And the age level that this targets is roughly grade 5 through 9. We've had some luck modifying for slightly younger learners, and certainly there are ways that you could dig deeper into the biology and biochemistry for learners that were older than 9th grade, but it targets 5th through 9th.
Okay, great. If there are any other questions, keep them coming. And while we're waiting, I'll just mention a couple of things. So the first is that we hold a sale every April. All curriculum is 25% off at that time. So if you're thinking about planning ahead for your 4-H year, keep that in mind. And we will be having a digital curriculum catalog this year, which should be on our website within the next couple of weeks or so. And that, of course, lists all of the different options that we have.
To answer Joyce's question, the primary supplies that you need here are Petri plates and then parafoam to seal those plates. The rest of that stuff you can pretty much pick up at Staples. It's like Sharpies. I think there's modeling clay for the growth activity. We purchase those supplies through Fisher Scientific because the University of Tennessee has contract with them, but I would say whatever scientific supply company your institution has its contract with. And you can purchase those Petri plates pre-poured, or if you've got a really any department on campus, any of your micro departments or food science departments, you might also could work with them to get them to donate plates to you as well.
Okay, I'll make another note here. We are in the midst of our Meet the Author webinar series. So we started at the end of January and we'll be running webinars through the end of March. And there's a link to the webinar page on the 4-H Mall, and that's in your resource list there. So we hope that you're able to join us. We have another one today at 2 o'clock Eastern on diversity and inclusion, and that actually will feature several different curriculum across the country. And then We also, as I mentioned earlier, are recording the webinar. So if there's a webinar that's already passed and you missed it, go ahead and watch the recording. Just register as if it's upcoming and you'll be directed to the recording. Okay, and if there are no other questions, then I guess that brings us to the end of our presentation. Jennifer's contact information is available in the presenter info box if there's questions after the fact, and of course you can always contact us at the National 4-H Council. Thank you all for your questions and your feedback. It's great to see that there's interest in the curriculum. I was telling Jennifer before we started that we have a printed copy now. So this is that new that we just have the printed copy and it looks fantastic. So I hope that you're all able to use and enjoy it as well. And so with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. Again, Jennifer, thank you so much for your time, not only to develop the curriculum, but your time today, for sharing your expertise with all of us. And I hope everyone has a great day. Bye-bye.